migrants are vulnerable to various human rights abuses and violations, particularly in transit, at international borders, and also in the countries that they are migrating to. They're at risk of exploitation, trafficking, and deportation. They also face denial of their civil and political rights, such as the right to liberty and security. In most cases, migrants are arbitrarily arrested and detained, either when they are traveling in transit or in their countries where they are migrating to. They also face denial of their economic and social and cultural rights, such as the right to health, the right to education. In some contexts, migrants also face discrimination, particularly in employment and also in enjoyment of various human rights. So it is very critical to ensure that the rights of migrants are protected. As a general principle of international human rights law, every person, regardless of their nationality or legal status, is entitled to fundamental human rights and legal protections. So what that means is that every person, regardless of your legal status, regardless of whether or not you are a migrant, you are entitled to certain human rights. So there are various international and regional human rights instruments that have been adopted at the international level and at the regional level that protect the rights of migrants. At the international level, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Although it does not specifically talk about migrants per se, it applies to every person. So some of the rights that are protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is the right to be protected against violence, protection against arbitrary detention. And we find that these rights are very important because for migrants, usually in transit, they are subjected to violence by either private actors or state actors. So the fact that these rights are specifically enshrined in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is very important in as far as protecting the rights of migrants. Other rights that are protected by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are the right to freedom of movement. These rights are also very important, not just for every person, but for migrants in particular. We also have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which protects the rights such as the right to health, the right to education, the right to housing. As I mentioned earlier, these rights are of general application, but they also apply to migrants as well. And then these are just a few of the international conventions. There are many other conventions that have been adopted at the international level that protects the rights of migrants. Other instruments are the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It protects female migrants from discrimination, for example, in areas of employment and other areas in their public and private life. And then at the regional level, we have various regional instruments that have been adopted which protect the rights of migrants. So we have the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It contains several provisions that also protect the rights of migrants. An example is protection against arbitrary arrest and detention. As I mentioned earlier, migrants usually, when they're in transit or even when they are in the countries that they've migrated to, are often subjected to arbitrary arrest and detention. So that is also a right that is protected in the African Charter. We also have various resolutions that have been adopted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which also protect the rights of migrant workers. But at the international level as well, the United Nations General Assembly has specifically adopted the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers and their Families. So unlike the other instruments that I've mentioned, this particular convention is specifically targeted towards protecting the rights of migrant workers. So it protects the rights of all migrant workers, whether or not they're documented or undocumented. So it contains various rights that are applicable to migrant workers. For instance, there's protection of the right to equality and non-discrimination. That's a right that's guaranteed in the convention. It also protects migrant workers and their families from violence, protects them from arbitrary arrest and detention. It also protects their right to health, their right to education, and their right to housing. And then it also specifically contains rights that are targeted towards migrant workers who are documented or migrants who are in a regular situation. And the rights that relate to migrants in a regular situation are the right to social protection, the right to educational services, and other rights. Unfortunately, I can't go into so much detail as I only have 15 minutes to make my presentation. But another thing that I would just like to talk about is the alternatives to migration. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the issues that migrants are usually confronted with is arbitrary arrest and detention. So under international human rights law, every person, whether or not you're a migrant or not, you have the right to protection against arbitrary detention and arrest. So what that means is that you cannot just be arrested unless there are justifiable reasons why you should be arrested. So there's protection against arbitrary detention, and this is a right that is guaranteed in Article 16 of the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families. It is also protected in other international and regional human rights instruments that I've also mentioned earlier. But then what happens, say for instance, if a migrant has been arrested, what rights do they have upon arrest? So they have a right to be protected against violence. In most cases when you're arrested, especially if you're a migrant, you're subjected to violence, you're subjected to torture, cruel and degrading treatment. So one of the rights that is guaranteed to migrants who find themselves in detention is the right to protection from violence. Another right that is guaranteed if you find yourself arrested is the right to be informed of the reasons for your arrest. And that's very important because it helps you prepare your defense. You need to know why you've been arrested so that you can prepare a good defense. Another right that you're guaranteed if you're arrested, you need to be brought promptly before a judge within a reasonable time. So a reasonable time, it depends with the circumstances of the arrest, but it has to be a reasonable time. If you're not brought before a judge or court before a reasonable time, then international law says that you have to be released from detention. And then another right that is guaranteed for migrants that have been arrested is the right to consular protection and assistance. So for instance, if you're a migrant and you've been arrested in, let's say, the UK, you have the right to seek assistance from your consular or embassy in the UK. It's a right that is internationally guaranteed. Another right is the right to compensation. So if you have been unlawfully arrested, let's say if there are no valid reasons why you were detained, under international law you have the right to compensation for an unlawful arrest. Other rights are also the right to free legal assistance, and you also have the right to an interpreter. Maybe if you're arrested in a country whereby they speak a language that you're not familiar with, you have the right to be provided with an interpreter to assist you to understand exactly why you have been arrested. And then closely related to the issue of arrest and detention is currently there's a global trend towards the abolition of immigration detention. So under international human rights law, the states are encouraged to use detention as a measure of last resort. And then just to quickly move on, Another thing that migrants are also protected from is the right to not be subjected against mass expulsion or repatriation. So this is a right that is guaranteed in various international human rights instruments, such as Article 22 of the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families. It's also guaranteed in Article 12 of the African Charter. So if in the case that there's a decision is made to repatriate a migrant, there are certain rights that a migrant is entitled to. So you can't just be repatriated without exercising those rights. So one of the rights is they have to communicate the decision to repatriate you or to expel you from their country. Once that decision has been communicated to you, you have the right to challenge that decision. So it shouldn't be just a once-off decision and then you're repatriated. You have the right to actually seek judicial review of that decision and to challenge that decision to be repatriated. And also, once you're in the process of challenging that decision to be repatriated, you are allowed to stay in that country until a final determination has been made regarding whether or not you should be expatriated or expelled from that particular country.